Welcome to this video that's part of the pilot incapacitation series. This time we're looking at whole airplane parachutes. What kind of options do we as controllers have if we're talking to the passenger who's now on the radio because the pilot has had the proverbial heart attack and they're in something like a Cirrus aircraft where that whole airplane parachute is at least an option? For the record, I'm filming this on January 20th of 2021. I literally have just one slide, and that's this slide here in the very simplistic PowerPoint that I nonetheless spent hours and hours working on. So as a prerequisite, I have the video called Understanding Whole Airplane Parachute Deployments, and I go through just what happens in Cirrus and other airplanes when these whole airplane parachute systems deploy and so on. For what it's worth, you might have to wait a little bit. I'm uploading that video as we speak. It looks like there's about 6 minutes left, so if you try to go to YouTube in the next 6 minutes, you're not going to find the video I'm talking about. Having said that, let's get a little more serious, and just by way of refresher, in that video, I talked very briefly about a document that Cirrus publishes called The Guide to the Cirrus Airframe Parachute System. I just want to note a couple things very briefly from this one, that of the possible CAPS deployment situations, one of the ones that is absolutely recommended by the Cirrus Corporation and by the companies that, or the company that makes these parachutes, pilot incapacitation may occur from a wide variety of causes, ranging from a pilot's medical condition to a bird strike that injures the pilot. If incapacitation occurs and the passengers are not trained to land the aircraft, CAPS activation is strongly recommended. For what it's worth, my own personal opinion, having flown Cirrus with non-pilots in the passenger seat and so on, when I fly the Cirrus, I do tell them as part of the briefing before we go that this thing does have a parachute. I would be the only one to pull it unless I become incapacitated for some reason. If so, I show them the basics of what they would do and so on. And so it's always possible that we're just going to have a passenger pull the chute. However, suppose for the sake of discussion that a passenger in one of these situations calls us for help and they have not yet pulled the chute. I would recommend pulling the chute. However, pulling the chute does have various risks, and as long as the situation is stable, as I've talked about in other videos in the pilot incapacitation series, I do think that people can actually fly airplanes fairly easily, either with or without the autopilot in most cases. Therefore, while I think the landing itself is risky, and so I don't want them to do the landing, I do think the parachute is absolutely preferable. Ideally, what I'd like to do is get them into a good situation before they pull the chute. As I talked about in what I'm calling that prerequisite video, once you pull the chute, there is no going back. Number two, you are going to drift with the wind, so we do want to be aware of that. And then generically, I would just like to put them in a spot where they are going to be roughly 2,000 feet AGL. Doesn't have to be exact, but I think roughly 2,000 feet AGL is ideal. That way, once they pull the chute, they've got a little more than a minute before they get down to the ground. Unless the wind is really strong, they're not going to drift that far. We have a very good idea of where they're going to go down. Ideally, we would have first responders on the ground in the area where they are expected to go down. You're smart enough to figure out something like a rural area is probably better than an urban area. And for what it's worth, again, I'm not advocating for this, but I kind of understand that one or two TV helicopters might be in the area, and maybe a sheriff's department helicopter or something like that, and that will help identify the exact spot. Just in case in a rural area, they still end up a couple hundred yards from some road, and they can get first responders to the aircraft quickly by having a helicopter or somebody kind of overseeing the operation. All right, for what it's worth, I'm going to use the Pilot's Operating Handbook for a Cirrus SR-22, and we're going to look at one of the checklist items under Section 3 Emergency Procedures. For what it's worth, more coincidentally than anything else, Section 2 Limitations is a section in Pilot Operating Handbooks where it typically has all kinds of placards and things like that, and on Cirrus manuals, at least this one, what they show is this is the labeling that goes on the cover, okay, for the parachute activation handle that's up in the ceiling. If you want to, you can kind of glance at this. This is the kind of thing I show passengers before I take them up in a Cirrus. So it's used for extreme emergencies only. You got to have your seatbelt on. Here's the lawyerly warning. Use of this device can result in injury or death. The maximum demonstrated deployment speed is 133 knots. That is not a limitation. It is basically a recommendation that you don't open the chute above that speed. But if you're above that speed when you pull the chute, everything should work fine. All right, and then the activation procedure. And this is not the full procedure. This is really the abbreviated procedure, but it's enough if you really needed it. So the fuel mixture, it says to cut off, so you're shutting off the engine. This cover that's up in the ceiling, remove it if it's not already been removed. The rocket activation handle, pull it straight down. It says both hands, maximum force, steady pull, do not jerk handle. It takes roughly 45 pounds of pull force to get that parachute rocket to activate. And then once you've done that, fuel selector handle to off, the electrical master switches, I'm going to make that the plural, to off, and the restraint system, i.e. your seat belts, make sure it's secure. So that's, again, kind of the simplistic version. Let's go to the full official checklist for CAPS deployment. And keep in mind that for some of these, part of the way this is worded is in case somebody has an engine failure just after takeoff and they're engaging it very quickly in that kind of situation. They don't have time to pull the checklist out. But suppose for the sake of discussion we have one of these situations. We're guiding somebody over towards an ideal area. We're going to have a little bit of time while we do so, and I'm going to argue that it's not a big deal, but this checklist, the way it's worded and the order in which it occurs, is actually not what we want, precisely because we're going to have time before the event. And so what we would like to do is sort of adapt this checklist. Also, this is officially the one for the SR-22. It should be fine for all of the SR-22 models, for all the SR-20s. I'm not sure how that would work for the SF-50. Vision Jet. If somebody wants to take me up for a flight in the Vision Jet solely for my own educational purposes, you're welcome to invite me to do so. Having said that, I'm going to more or less constrain my remarks to the SR-20 and 22 airplanes. All right, so airspeed minimum possible. And we already talked about the maximum demonstrated deployment speed of 133 knots. My thinking on that is this. It says airspeed minimum possible. Yeah, with a regular pilot, that's fine under these kinds of circumstances because the slower you are, the gentler the forces when the parachute first deploys and so on. However, if you activate it at a higher speed, there's no injury per se. Maybe, somebody, gets bruised up a little bit or something, but that's utterly survivable, and there is a definite risk by trying to slow it as slow as you can if we're having a passenger fly the airplane. So I would have them fly the airplane at approximately the top of the white arc. Depending on the model Cirrus, that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 105, 110 knots or so. You're well above stall speed, so there's no risk on the low end, and for what it's worth, you're definitely underneath the maximum demonstrated deployment speed of 133. So I would target approximately the top of the white arc. Remember, we're going to have to keep in mind that there can be two situations. One, somebody's flying the airplane using the autopilot, and one, somebody's flying the airplane without the autopilot. Now, step 2 in the official checklist says to use the mixture if time and altitude permit. Now, in these situations that we're talking about, time and altitude would permit, right? So it says mixture, so cut off the engine, so you shut off the engine, and then you're activating the rocket. I don't like that in these passenger situations where it's a pilot incapacitation event, because I actually can't really feel comfortable guaranteeing that the passenger is successfully going to pull that handle the way that they should with enough pull, for whatever reason, okay? Therefore, I want to keep in mind that we want to keep the engine running through the deployment and then shut it off afterwards, just in case they have some trouble activating the rocket to deploy the parachute. Number 2, let's suppose that we get somebody in some kind of stable flight configuration, and then they were to follow this existing checklist to the T, and they suddenly, mixture to idle cutoff, and then they go to reach for the handle. Well, if you're, say, trimmed out in level flight, or you've got the autopilot flying the airplane, and you go mixture to idle cutoff, the airplane's going to start slowing depending on whether the autopilot's on or off. The airplane nose might drop somewhat as you suddenly shut the engine off. Okay, and a pilot's going to be expecting that. A passenger is not. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons I don't like that. You can do it, I'm not prohibiting it, but what I would recommend, and let me break this up into autopilot on or autopilot off. Let's start with autopilot off. So autopilot off, they're going to be hand flying. You just want to get the airplane in trim. They're just going to use fingertip pressure to make sure the wings are basically level with the ailerons. And as they come into the preferred area, and I'll talk about the preferred area in a couple minutes, okay, what I would recommend is they just slowly bring the power back to idle. That is, for all intents and purposes, just perfectly fine in terms of getting the engine shut off, even if we're going to defer the actual shut off until after the parachute has come out. So they just gently bring the throttle back to idle, okay, assuming they're hand flying. We're going to prep them for this. That means the nose is going to come down, but the airplane will stay speed stable plus or minus a couple knots, okay? So they've gone back to idle. The nose is going to gently come down. The airplane is speed stable, still at approximately the top of the white arc or so. Then they're going to pull that handle, again, just a steady pull, both hands straight down, takes about 45 pounds of pull force, and then assuming that the parachute does deploy successfully, then we're going to pick up with kind of step 5 about mixture to the cutoff position, because we've not done it here. If for some reason, on the other hand, the parachute does not deploy, maybe they just don't know, they don't think that they can pull it that hard or whatever, okay? So for whatever reason, they don't get the parachute out. If the throttle's at idle and they were hand flying, it's real simple. You just kind of add power again, and we're going to reset and try it again. It's not a big deal. A similar kind of principle on if they're using the autopilot, although we do want to be mindful of what sort of vertical mode the autopilot is in. So a couple of options. One would be something like an altitude hold mode. One would be a vertical speed mode, and then one would be like an indicated airspeed, or FLC, pronounced filch mode, which is just a fancy version. That's a cool way of saying indicated airspeed. So if they're in something like an altitude hold mode, as you're coming into the preferred area with some kind of speed, you bring the power back to idle. Well, what's going to happen is the airplane's going to start to slow, and because the airplane's going to start to slow while the autopilot tries to hold the altitude, they're then going to be trying to pull the rocket, to activate the parachute. If it comes out real quick, that's fine. But if for some reason it doesn't come out, the airplane's still slowing, holding altitude. Now, my understanding is most, if not all, of these autopilots will sense that the airplane is getting too slow, and so they will lower the nose to prevent a stall while on autopilot. But I really can't guarantee that, and I don't want to be even flirting with that. So I don't think that's a good way to do it. Another option would be a vertical speed mode. Here, what we would do is set them up a little bit higher, so maybe they're up at something like 2,500 or 3,000 feet AGL. Put it into a vertical speed mode where they start a descent of something on the order of about 800-ish feet per minute. Doesn't have to be exactly 800, though personally that's what I would use. Okay, and as they're descending into an 800 foot per minute descent, they are simultaneously bringing the power back to idle. So now with power at idle descending at about 800 feet a minute, okay, the airplane's nice and stable. Go ahead and activate the parachute. And when that happens, it's going to override whatever the autopilot's doing, assuming it comes out. If for some reason it doesn't come out, then they're still stuck, as it were, idle power, 800 foot per minute, and they're still 2,000 feet above the ground. It's very simple to just vertical speed, roll it slowly back to zero, add some power to keep the speed up, and that's a nice way to recover from that maneuver. You could put it in an indicated airspeed hold mode, so just have them get set up so that they are in level flight. Again, ballpark 3,000 AGL, okay, to speed about the top of the white arc. Put it into the indicated airspeed or filch mode as appropriate for the buttonology on that particular autopilot. And as long as the speed is about where we want it, then they bring the power back to idle. If you're flying the autopilot in an indicated airspeed or filch hold mode and you bring the power back to idle, the nose will come down to maintain that speed. That's the whole point of what that autopilot mode is for, basically. And then again, they're at idle power, they're descending, you try to pull the chute. If the chute comes out, the autopilot's going to kick off anyway, and even if it doesn't kick off for some reason, there's nothing for it to do because you're now drifting under the chute. Okay, and if for some reason the chute doesn't come out, all you got to do is add power, and the nose will pitch up, okay, in order to maintain. So you got to think through exactly what's going to happen with the autopilot, and it's really just the vertical mode if you're going to use the autopilot. But you always, in my mind, have to protect for the slim possibility that the passenger is not going to be able to get the rocket activated on the first try. Okay, so let's assume for purposes of discussion, though, that they get the parachute deployed. So now it is really after deployment. Again, I prefer that they're at idle power. It can be they've got the mixture shut off already. I'm not going to prohibit that. But the mixture, if we haven't already done so, we make sure that the mixture is cut off, and we will have prepped them for these things as appropriate. The fuel selector to off. In the SR20 and 22s, that's on the center console. It's within easy reach. It's a very easy thing for them to do. The battery and alternator master switches are over on the far left. For most people, that should be an easy reach across to there. The ignition switch, the keys for the magnetos, that's going to be typically a little farther reach, way over on the far left of the instrument panel. If they can reach it, fine. If they can't, it's not a big deal. You can just leave them on in my opinion. The fuel pump to off, that's a switch that's over there by the throttle. I think in most cases it would already be off, but we would do that if we need to. It says ELT to on. Well, we're going to be talking as controllers to them. We're going to have the first responders pre-positioned. There's going to be a couple TV helicopters and a sheriff's department helicopter, watching them as they go down. There's no need for the ELT. Seatbelts, yes, get that on. Loose items, secure. If we're going to do that, which is not a bad idea, that actually goes in as step 0. We do that long before we get them to the preferred location and the right speed and the right autopilot mode or whatever and deploy the chute. So we're not doing that as item 12. That's item 0. Okay, and we're going to prep them for after the airplane comes to a stop, evacuate quickly. And if there is any surface wind, they should move to the upwind side and so on. So my point is we just need to modify this checklist a little bit with some particular thought given to autopilot vertical modes if they are on the autopilot. And with that in mind, all right, so you can watch the low-res version now, or you might have to wait a couple hours for the high-def version of that prerequisite video to come out. All right, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to let FlightAware load and see how busy it is across the United States right now. And we're going to do this. We're going to do live flight tracking, browse by aircraft type, and we are going to pick some random person in an SR-20 as the first of our demonstrations. So let's see what we have in terms of live traffic right now. I do not quite know what to expect. All right, so we've got, let's pick this airplane here, 478 Bravo Charlie, 7,500 feet eastbound. Looks like a nice VFR cruising altitude eastbound. And they took off from Centennial. Who knows where they're going? For the sake of discussion, let's assume that this presents to us now basically as one of these pilot incapacitation events and the passenger gets on the radio, has not already pulled the chute. For what it's worth, okay, I'm just using this as kind of a stand-in. What's sort of the ideal position in which to place this airplane? So we've got Goodland, Kansas out here, Burlington, Colorado. Okay, Interstate 70 along here. And for what it's worth, in terms of aviationweather.gov, I was looking at something earlier. Let me go out to this area. And again, Goodland, Kansas is going to be in this region here. So first I got to find it. Goodland and the lowest published altitude where you're above ground, but we're not so far above ground that we're going to get the temperature read up. The winds aloft right now at 6,000 MSL are from 320 at 42. So assuming they pull the chute at ballpark 2,000 feet-ish AGL, they're going to be drifting underneath the chute for a little over a minute. So at 42 knots or so, approximately, I'm guessing they're going to drift about 3/4 of a mile. So just picture that from the time they pull the chute until they get to the ground, they're going to drift about 3/4 of a mile or so. The other thing is we can't predict like exactly to the foot where the person's going to pull the chute. Even if for the sake of discussion, just for the moment, let's suppose that we wanted them to overfly and pull the chute like right as they came over this interchange here off of I-70 with Rose Avenue, okay? Well, just because they go to pull the chute at that point and we're thinking, okay, that means they're going to end up down here. That, who knows if they pulled a few seconds early or a few seconds late or whatever. So you do want to take that into account. So therefore, this one's actually not that hard. I would just put them in a location where I'm kind of thinking that there's going to be something like a 3 mile by 3 mile-ish area where they're going to end up coming down. And to the extent we can, if we have time, get the local first responders out there. And I suppose in some ideal situation, we might find an area, preferably away from water. I'd prefer not to put them in a spot where if we can avoid it, there's a chance they're going to come down in water. The Cirrus airplanes have come down under the chute into water, and they tend to be survivable. However, it's a fairly rough smack. I can't rule out some back injuries. What happens is the belly of the airplane kind of hits all at once, almost like a belly flop. The landing gear provides no cushioning. You can have some, minor back injuries, but it can be, a significant amount of back pain when you first hit. My understanding is that's been documented. I haven't double-checked that through thorough research. But then number two, you've got somebody who's maybe in a retention pond. First responders can't get to them right away. And remember, part of our setup here is a pilot incapacitation event. You've got somebody who's maybe unconscious or whatever from a heart attack, and that doesn't mean they're automatically dead. But now we're trying to get them out of an airplane that may or may not be slowly sinking, and we don't necessarily have a boat to get to them. So if you can, perhaps in some places, easier said than done, might be tougher in Minnesota. But if you can find something that's ballpark 3 mile-ish by 3 mile-ish grid and get some first responders out there, so you got one on each corner or something like that, as they come into that area, try to provide some local landmark so that they're pulling the chute. It doesn't particularly matter if the airplane is flying upwind or downwind, to my mind, when they pull the chute. It's going to take a few seconds for the chute to really, fully come out, but then once it does, they're just going to drift with the wind. So using this as an example and assuming we had a bit more time and position, and I'm not measuring this here, I'm just assuming this is something like that 3 mile by 3 mile grid. Okay, get some first responders out here kind of on the corners. About the time they come in over this somewhat bigger road straight north of this town, okay, that's when our passenger pulls the chute. From wherever it is they open the chute, they're going to drift something like 3/4 of a mile. And who knows, they may end up in the field and it's a couple hundred yards from some county road or something. But also, just like I say, keep in mind that kind of road structure. If you put them in an area where there's a big forest, it might take a little while to get to somebody. And in some worst case situations, if we don't have somebody else flying up above who can spot exactly where the airplane came down, even if we use something like Flight Aware or Flight Radar, as this person is now apparently descending in towards maybe Goodland, what's going to happen is we might have somebody go down and then kind of lose track of exactly where they are, because we might lose the radar, transponder type coverage somewhere down around here, and they drift. And while we might know they're kind of down somewhere in here, it still might take a little while to find them. So if you can, try to get another airplane, if there are no TV helicopters or Cirrus helicopters or something, up above, just so that they can spot the airplane when it goes down and can provide some detailed location. If you can't, I'd recommend using Flight Aware or Flight Radar or something like that. All right, let's just do one more. We're going to pick a random Cirrus SR-22, and since this area was relatively benign, let's pick some random Cirrus, if I can, 22. And there's more of them, so that's why I saved them second. Let's see if I can find somebody who's in a slightly rougher area. Here's somebody out by Payson, although this guy's getting ready to land. Let's see. We've got somebody just off of Tri-Cities Airport in slightly rough terrain. We're going to pick on this one, JD Aviation LLC, whoever this is, going from Tri-Cities out towards downtown Knoxville. Okay, so this SR-22, again, just kind of assume the similar kind of setup. And let's take a quick look at the winds aloft here. And so for the area around which area is Tri-City? And let's try that. Yes, okay. 300 at 40, so actually fairly similar to what it was out there in Goodland, Kansas. And again, so they're going to come from kind of the west-northwest for something like 3/4-ish of a mile from the time the chute actually comes open and so on until they get down to the ground. Keep that in mind, and let's just kind of see what we have here. The interstate, you're not going to get them right on the interstate, but I suppose if you're getting them near the interstate in some particular region, you do want to be a little mindful of that. Again, I think in terms of like a 3 mile by 3 mile grid, in terms of where we might put them down. And to the extent you can, if obviously a rural area is best with farm fields, you want to think about things like road access. I would try to keep them away from power lines. Again, you're never going to find a spot that has no power lines, I suppose, but try to keep them away from an area of power lines if you can. Wind turbine farms are particularly bad, and you're smart enough to figure out that mountainous areas, even if the airplane lands successfully, again, we're still maybe got somebody in the left front seat who's had the heart attack or the whatever, and if they end up up here on Stone Mountain or something and they're a few hundred feet up, it's going to be difficult to get to that person and get them prompt medical attention. So just use some common sense, but again, try to pre-position first responders if you can. Try to get somebody with eyeballs up high. I'm thinking loosely of a 3 mile by 3 mile grid using this adapted checklist. They end up pulling the chute, and maybe in this case, they might come down. That looks maybe like a not good spot to go. That's maybe just a distribution center, not the worst thing ever, but maybe somewhere down around here. Again, just use common sense, but that's the kind of stuff to think about. So with that, we'll see if my video is still processing the HD version. It is, so you're either just going to have to wait or just use the low-res version for the next half hour. All right, thank you for joining me, and these parachutes are wonderful things. Again, I have flown with passengers where I've briefed them before takeoff that if I have a heart attack, to rifle through my wallet and then pull the parachute if they want. Thank you.